Hi everybody, welcome back to WEGS Garage with the old guy. Today we're going to get back into our Triumph gearbox and see exactly what's in spec, what's out of spec, and what needs to happen to make this transmission run right. Couple of things as far as tackling this job. There are some things that we have that I wouldn't even think of attempting to do this without them. One thing that we have is the actual Triumph TR4 workshop manual. This is a manual that if you're going to do anything with this car anymore, I would highly recommend you get a copy of this thing, because this is what Triumph mechanics used to assemble and disassemble cars in the 60s when the TR4s were actually built. The other thing that I have at my disposal is the Greasy Hands Garage Guide to assembling and also taking apart the TR4 transmission. Now, this is actually off of a website called Green Country Triumphs, and it's indispensable because when we get into this transmission, which we will be doing, you can see here there's a blow apart of every gear, every spacer washer, and everything inside of that transmission. The other thing that's critical is at the bottom of the page, a lot of these washers, thrust washers, and spacers, they actually give the dimensions of what they should be for interior dimension, outside diameter, and also the thickness. And as we go through this input shaft and also the main shaft, we're going to be checking each and every one of these components to see if they're in spec. The first thing is to get the remnants of a bearing out of the input shaft. To get the bearing out of the input shaft, which is actually in this area, we're going to be using a 3-jaw pilot bearing puller that's expandable. We insert this inside the shaft, lock onto the flanges of the bearing, and then pull the bearing out, the remnants of it. Okay, here's what's left of the bearing that was inside of our input shaft. And remember this jar of parts and whatnot that was in the bottom casing of our gearbox? Well, now the story can be told. Obviously, this is what's left of the bearing that went into the input shaft. And these are the needles that went inside that bearing. You can see that the back part of this bearing actually let go. All the needles fell out, so who knows how long that the front of the main shaft has been riding into the rear of the input shaft without any bearing support whatsoever. The other thing that was in our jar was an assortment of springs and BBs that actually go in these synchro rings, and part of that may have happened on disassembly where they fell out, but they actually go in as so. So that explains our parts and pieces that were at the bottom of the casing of the gearbox when we took the thing apart. Now it's time to start checking clearances on our input and also main shaft on our TR transmission. First of all, as far as the input shaft is concerned, everything looks in good shape now that I finally got the remnants of that bearing out of here. The teeth on the gears all look good. I don't see any major wear and tear on those. As far as parts, we are missing some. One thing that I notice on the blow apart diagram is that on disassembly, ahead of the main bearing on the input shaft, there's a circlip, and then there's a washer, and then another clip. This washer, which is number 2 on the diagram, wasn't even on the shaft itself. So obviously we're going to have to get that. As far as we work our way down the line, number 7 is actually called an oil thrower. That piece is this one, and it is way out of spec, and I don't know what happened. If somebody years ago pried on it or whatever, but I noticed when I took it apart, all the gouges on it, and the fact that the inside of this has a sharp edge to it. And if I put it on the shaft, it's sloppy, and it's way out of spec as far as what this chart says, as far as inside diameter and outside diameter. So that's obviously gonna go. But other than that, I think our input shaft is in good shape. Just needs some different parts and pieces attached to it. As far as our main shaft is concerned, we'll start disassembling that now. Shaft itself looks like it's in good shape. I don't see any gouges or any worn grooves on the shaft itself. After going through the main shaft, it appears that the washers and bushings are in pretty good shape, but we have found a couple of problems. On the main shaft itself, all of the gears look all right. No signs of abnormal wear and tear or anything like that. One thing of concern though, and I've got this laying here just for demonstration's sake, off this rear synchro gear, we don't have the triangular washer that normally goes on here. They don't make it anymore. But when this is assembled, this washer goes between the casing and the bearing. In other words, the casing starts here, it ends here, and the bearing slips into the casing. If you hold the washer that goes on the outside of the bearing up to this, you'll see that there is just enough room to get the circlip in this groove, and that's good. But by doing that, we also end up with a gap between this washer and this synchro gear, and I'm not sure that that's right. The original transmission actually had, since there's splines on this, a triangular shaped washer that fit into this area. I think you can see it. You can see the splines that are on there because that clip inside the third gear pushes all this back. And this is where it ends up with this gap right here. And if we go over to the part sheet, you can see, hope you can see this, is actually this number 36 is the original piece. See how it's got actually holes cut in for the splines, so it slides over the shaft up against this synchro gear. And we don't have that, and they don't make it anymore. And the crux of the problem is, if you buy this new washer, this is what you get, and they charge $52 for it. After measuring this with the micrometer, this is the correct washer, but it still leaves a gap in there, and I'm not sure that's right, so we got to do a little more research on that. Otherwise, the rest of this looks pretty good, although we're probably going to go ahead and replace the synchro rings, the bushings, and some other things on it anyway, as long as we've got it opened up. But at least the expensive gears are in good shape. Next time on WEGS Garage, we'll get into the counter shaft and see what problems await for us there. The counter shaft is still laying on the bench. There are needle bearings on either side of the counter shaft. And this is a little more complicated as far as checking it out for end float and so forth. We still have that to do on this, on the main shaft, but we're obviously going to wait until we get new parts and pieces to check all of that out, because right now it isn't in spec. But for this edition, that about wraps it for WEGS Garage with the old guy. Thanks for watching. Mark, get the film to the processor, make the show, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. So here once again is the main shaft with all of the gears placed on the shaft. And almost looks like a kebab of gears. Meat, mushroom, pepper, meat, mushroom. Oh, never mind.